before the sun had fully lifted itself above the eastern cliffs. The river was already awake. It moved slowly, as it always did, carrying the memory of distant rains southward toward the sea, a wide, dark ribbon threading through pale sand and the soft green of reed beds. The Nile did not hurry. It had no reason to. It had been doing this for longer than any temple inscription could record, longer than the oldest stories the priests kept folded in linen in the coolest chambers of their sanctuaries. And along its banks, life arranged itself around the river's rhythms, the way reeds arrange themselves around still water naturally, without apparent effort, as if it could not have been otherwise. This particular morning belonged to the month the Egyptians called Thuth, in the third season of inundation, sometime in what we might place near the reign of Ramesses II. Though the villagers along this stretch of the river would not have thought of it that way. They would have said, it is the time when the water is pulling back, leaving behind its gift of dark silt. And soon the planting will begin. A small settlement of perhaps 300 souls occupied a low ridge above the floodline. The houses were built from mud brick cool inside. Even when the air above the sand quivered with heat, their roofs flat, their walls the color of the earth they were made from. Each house leaned gently into the next, sharing walls where it could, as if the buildings themselves understood the value of proximity in a land where shade was worth more than silver. The first figure to move through the village that morning was a woman named Ifrit, though she would not have considered herself unusual in any way. She was perhaps 30 years old, though she had never counted precisely, and she rose each morning before the light did, a habit she had learned from her mother and her mother's mother before that. She lit a small oil lamp, a shallow clay bowl with a twisted linen wick, and carried it to the corner of the room where the grinding stones waited. The grain was emmer wheat, harvested in the previous season and stored in tall pottery jars sealed with linen and a paste of Nile mud. She measured it by feel, by the weight of her palm, the way her hands had been taught without words, and she began to grind. The sound was low and rhythmic, stone against stone, a sound that had filled Egyptian mornings for as long as the river itself, and it moved through the quiet house like something almost musical. Outside, the sky was shifting. The deep blue of night was warming at its edges, becoming a thin, luminous copper along the horizon, and the first bird's ibis, mostly, stepping through the shallows of a receding pool left by the inundation, were beginning to move with that particular deliberateness of creatures who treat dawn as a matter requiring full attention. Nefrit's husband, a man named Amenhotep, though everyone called him Amene, was already at the river. He had gone before she woke, slipping out with his casting net folded over one shoulder, his feet finding the familiar path down the ridge without the help of any light. He had fished this part of the Nile since he was old enough to wade without his father's hand at his shoulder, and the water held no surprises for him, only the slow, reliable negotiation between a man's patience and the movement of things beneath the surface. That the net opened like a flower above the dark water, hung for a breath at its fullest point of extension, then settled. Amene watched the rings spread outward across the calm surface, each one widening and thinning until it became invisible, absorbed back into the river's indifference. He waited. The morning light was arriving by degrees now, the copper at the horizon deepening to gold, and somewhere in the reed beds a frog completed its last long note of the night and went silent. When he pulled the net in, there were 3 fish perch, likely, though the morning was still too dim to see their colors properly. He placed them in a clay pot with a small amount of river water, covered it loosely with a palm frond, and cast the net again, back in the village. The day was gathering momentum in the quiet, unhurried way of a place that has done this 10,000 times before. A neighbor's goat strained at its tether near the low wall of a courtyard, tugging toward a tuft of dried grass with the single-minded devotion of small animals everywhere. Children began to appear in doorways, blinking and slow, their hair still pressed flat from sleep, their linen kilts wrinkled into soft folds. An older girl, perhaps 9 or 10, was already helping her grandmother sort through a bundle of flax stems, pulling out the rotten ones with practiced fingers, discarding them in a pile that would later be used to start the bread oven. The bread oven was a clay dome-shaped and chest-high, that sat against the outer wall of Nefrit's house. She had been heating it since the grinding was done, feeding small chips of dried dung and acacia wood into its mouth until the interior glowed a steady amber. The dough she had shaped from the morning's flour mixed with a little water and a small clay pot of saved starter was flat and round, and she laid it against the inner wall of the oven with the practiced confidence of someone who has never once burned her fingers doing this, not because it was easy, but because she had simply done it so many times that her hands knew how close was too close. The smell that rose from the oven was deep and warm, the smell of something fundamental being made from something simple, and it drifted through the still morning air across the courtyard and down toward the river, joining the smell of water and mud and the distant sweetness of flowering tamarisk. And for a moment, the whole of the day seemed to hang in that fragrance, unhurried, whole. This was the world along the Nile as the sun found the tops of the eastern cliffs and began, with great patience, to fill the valley with gold. And the day, as all its days before it had done, was only just beginning. The bread had come out well that morning, Nefret could tell by the weight of it in her hands, and by the way the crust had pulled away from the clay mold in one clean piece, leaving nothing behind. She set the loaves to cool on a flat stone near the door and stood for a moment listening to the village stir itself into wakefulness around her. Somewhere to the left, old Ivy's goat complained about something, as it always did at this hour. Somewhere further along the lane, a child was being called in from wherever children go before the sun is fully out. The smell of other cook fires drifted through the air, onions softening in fact, the faint sweetness of date wine being opened. The clay and smoke smell that belonged to mornings in this place and no other. Nefret untied her apron and folded it over the low wall. There was beer to be seen to. The brewing had begun 3 days ago, when she had soaked the barley and left it to sprout in a wide flat basket near the warmth of the oven. Now the grain sat in a tall clay vessel half buried in the cool earth of the back room, breathing quietly in the dark, beginning its slow conversion into something that would keep them nourished through the long working days ahead. She lifted the cloth that covered it, bent close, and breathed in. The smell was yeasty and alive, faintly sour in the way that meant everything was going as it should. She pressed her palm against the side of the vessel. Faintly warm. Good. 2 more days, perhaps. 3 if the weather turned cool again. Beer was not a luxury here. It was part of the calculation of living poured out at midday for the men in the fields, offered to visitors, given to children diluted with water, because the river water alone could not always be trusted. Nefret had learned to brew from her mother, who had learned from hers, and the small differences in each woman's method, a handful more of spelt, a longer sprouting time. The particular clay of the vessel had accumulated over generations into something that was very nearly a family signature, recognizable to anyone who had tasted it. She replaced the cloth and went back out into the light. The lane that ran past their house was narrow and pale with dry dust, still bearing the faint ghost of where the floodwater had reached 2 weeks ago, a tied line of dried silt on the mud brick wall at hip height, already beginning to flake away. Beyond the lane, the plots were being measured. Nefret paused at the corner of the wall to watch. The men with the knotted rope were from the office of the gnome, which was to say they were not from the village itself, though one of them had a face she almost recognized from the market at IPT last season. They moved with quiet authority through the soft dark earth that the inundation had left, unreeling their measuring cord between wooden stakes, calling numbers to a third man who crouched with a writing board and noted everything in neat columns. The farmers stood and watched with the particular expression of men who have done this every year of their lives and have made their peace with the fact that the outcome is largely predetermined, and yet could not quite stop themselves from watching anyway. This was how the fields were redistributed after each flood. The water erased everything: boundaries, paths, old argument lines between neighbors, and each year the ropemen came and drew the world back into its parcels, assigning to each family what had been agreed upon, noting the quality of the soil, estimating what the harvest might yield so that the grain share owed to the estate could be calculated before a single seed was planted. It was a very old system. Nefret did not know how old. Her grandmother had spoken of it as something that had always been so, and her grandmother's grandmother had presumably said the same. And so the measuring cord had been moving through the black silt of the Nile since a time before memory gave out entirely. She did not stay to watch it finish. She had oil to find. The market, such as it was, happened at the edge of the village most mornings, not a market in the sense of a permanent place with fixed stalls, but an organic gathering of people who had things and people who needed things, settling into the same approximate spot by long habit. Nefret took the 2 spare loaves she had baked, she had calculated for this, and wrapped them in a scrap of linen. The woman she was looking for was already there, sitting beside a clay jar with her legs crossed, fanning herself with a palm frond. Her name was Twee, and she kept the only small plot of castor plants in this part of the village, pressing the oil herself with a stone press that was older than she was. She was perhaps 50, lean and brown and deliberate in her movements, the kind of person who weighed everything before she spoke. Nefret held up the 2 loaves. Twi looked at them for a moment that was not hesitation exactly, but rather a form of courtesy. The pause that acknowledged both parties were reasonable people engaged in a negotiation between equals. Then Twi nodded once, and reached for a small clay vessel with a fitted lid, and the exchange was made. Nefret walked home with the oil. Around her the morning continued to unfold at its own pace, a donkey being led past with bundles of dried reed tied across its back, 2 women sorting flax by the side of the lane, a group of children chasing something through the gap between houses. With a particular focused joy of children who have found something worth chasing, she set the oil beside the oven and sat down on the low bench that ran along the inside wall. The bread was cool now. She broke a small piece from the end of one loaf, the burned edge that would not be missed, and chewed it slowly. Outside, the measuring rope was still moving across the fields. The goat was still expressing its opinions. Amani would not be back from the river until the sun had moved well past its center, and until then the house was hers, quietly and completely, in the way that it was always most fully hers in these middle hours when everything was in motion and she alone was briefly still. The oil caught the light where it sat in its small vessel. The bread was good. The beer was on its way. One morning was passing into the next part of itself, and whatever the afternoon might ask of her, it had not asked yet. In the stillness that followed the market's quiet dispersal, the house held its breath around her. Nefret sat with her back against the cool mud brick wall, the small vessel of castor oil resting in her lap, and let herself simply be for a moment, neither working nor planning, only listening. A fly moved in slow circles near the ceiling. Somewhere outside, a child called out a name, and then was silent. The shadow of the doorway had shifted a few fingers' width to the east since she had last looked at it, and that small movement told her that the day was not standing still. Even if she was not, it was the kind of pause that did not announce itself as rest it arrived, the way water finds a hollow in the ground, filling the space without asking permission. She had earned it without meaning to. The beer was turning as it should. The bread had gone to Twi. The oil sat in her hands, its weight modest and satisfying, but the afternoon would not wait. And Nefret knew its demands as well as she knew her own hands. She rose and set the oil vessel on the high shelf beside the small faience figure of Taurit, the broad-bellied goddess who watched over women in labor and in ordinary life alike, whose blue-green glaze had faded to something closer to the color of old river mud. Nefret touched the figure lightly, not in prayer exactly, but in the comfortable acknowledgement one gives a presence that has always been there. Then she gathered her carrying cloth and went out again into the afternoon sun. The linen washing was the task she had been putting off since dawn. Every household had its rhythms of deferral, and the washing of cloth was one of those things that could always be done tomorrow, until tomorrow became the morning when there was nothing clean to wear to the granary, or nothing to wrap around the bread before it was carried to a neighbor. Nefret had a bundle of worn linen tucked in the corner near the grinding stone. Her husband Amenhotep's broad work kilt stiffened at the hem with dried mud, a length of loosely woven cloth she used as a head wrap, and the smaller rectangle of linen that her daughter Merit, who was 7 years old and already developing strong opinions about everything, insisted on wearing tied around her waist like a sash, even though it served no practical purpose Nefret had yet been able to identify. She carried the bundle to the canal's edge, where the bank sloped gently down to a stretch of packed clay that the village women had used for washing since a time before anyone could say when. The clay was smooth from generations of use, worn into a shallow bowl of a ledge just above the waterline, and it smelled of wet reeds and something faintly mineral. The clean cold smell that came up from deep water. 2 other women were already there. One was Ipe's granddaughter, a girl of perhaps 14, whose name Nefret could never remember without embarrassment. She had been told 3 times, and each time the syllables slipped away like water through fingers. The girl was washing a coarse linen net used for catching fish, dragging it back and forth through the shallows with practiced efficiency, not looking up. The other woman was older, heavyset, with arms the color of old cedar and the kind of face that had long since settled into a permanent expression of calm concentration. Her name was Hennet, and she washed linen for several households in exchange for grain. It was her trade, as surely as ties was the pressing of castor oil. Hennet glanced up when Nefret arrived, assessed the bundle under her arm, and nodded once, the way craftspeople acknowledge each other's presence at a shared worksite. Nefret set down her bundle and knelt at the water's edge. The canal here was a narrow arm of the great river's generosity, slower than the main channel. shaded along one bank by a row of persea trees, whose roots had long since made themselves at home in the soft mud. The water that morning was the color of bronze held at a certain angle in firelight, still carrying the last thinning memory of the inundation sediment. By the dry season, it would run clear and low, and then the village would worry in the particular quiet way that people worry about things they cannot control with their bodies rather than their words. With the extra trips to check the water level, with the careful measuring out of stored grain, she worked the linen against the clay ledge in long rhythmic strokes, turning the cloth and working back over the same ground. Natron was too precious to use for ordinary washing. The fine stuff was saved for the preparation of the dead, and the coarser grades were traded at prices that made Nefret consider, each time, whether the linen might simply be worn a little longer. Instead, she used a small block of rendered fat mixed with powdered clay, rubbed in circles, the way her mother had shown her, and her mother's mother before that, in a lineage of practical knowledge that required no words to be passed on because the hands themselves remembered. Hennet, working beside her, moved through her washing with a speed and economy of motion that Nefret always found quietly impressive. The older woman did not scrub so much as persuade a careful handling of the cloth that seemed to coax the dirt loose rather than force it. She hummed something formless under her breath, the kind of sound that is not quite a song, only the audible shape of a mind turned comfortably inward. They did not talk much, the women at the canal's edge. This was one of those hours that belonged to the body rather than to conversation, to the ache that built slowly in the arms and shoulders, to the cold of the water numbing the fingers, to the small satisfaction of wringing out a length of linen and seeing it emerge visibly lighter, cleaner, temporarily restored to something close to what it had been when it was new. The fishnet girl finished before either of them and carried her dripping work back up the bank without a word, the net draped over both arms like a ceremonial offering. When the washing was done, Nefret spread the linen on the low acacia scrub at the bank's upper edge, where the afternoon sun fell without shadow. The cloth would be dry before evening. She straightened up slowly, pressing one hand against the small of her back where the kneeling had left its mark, and stood for a moment looking out across the canal toward the opposite bank, where a man she did not recognize was moving along the far shore with a donkey, both of them proceeding at the unhurried pace of those who have no reason to arrive quickly. The river beyond them was wide and pale and entirely untroubled by anything that was happening on its banks. Hennet had already begun to fold the dry portions of her own work, her movements neat and final. She said, without looking up, that the festival of the goddess at the end of the month would require a clean offering cloth, and that whoever among them planned to make an offering would do well to start their washing now rather than in 3 days' time when everyone else would be down here doing the same thing. It was practical advice offered without particular emphasis, the kind of observation that was not quite a recommendation and not quite a warning, only a sharing of information between people who organized their lives around the same calendar. Nefret said that she would keep it in mind. She gathered her remaining things and started back toward the village, her feet finding the familiar path without thought. The afternoon sun was lower now, angled rather than overhead, and the shadows of the houses had begun to lean toward the east in the slow, unhurried way of shadows that have all evening ahead of them. The day was not yet finished. Merit would need to be found. The evening bread would need to be started. Amenhotep would return from the fields as the light failed, tired in the particular way of a man who has spent the day moving heavy things. And there would be a meal and a fire and the small accumulated ordinary talk of two people who know each other well enough to say very little and mean a great deal. All of this waited ahead of her, patient and familiar, like a room she had walked into 10,000 times and would walk into again tonight, and find everything more or less where she had left it. In the hour before the shadows lengthened into evening, Nefret passed through the low doorway of her house and set the damp bundle of linens on the worn reed mat just inside the entrance, where they still held enough warmth to begin the drying. The mud walls were thick, as all walls in the village were thick, built to keep the midday heat outside and the cooler darkness within, and even now, with the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western cliffs, the interior felt like cupped hands close, sheltering, faintly scented with old bread and dried herbs, and the particular smell of a room where the same family had slept and eaten for many years. Merit was not inside. Nefret stepped back out and found her daughter, crouched near the wall of the neighboring house, entirely absorbed in the task of pressing small pellets of Nile mud into the spaces between two flat stones. arranging and rearranging them with the focused solemnity of someone engaged in very serious work. The girl did not look up. Nefret watched her for a moment, the small brown shoulders, the side lock of hair that marked her as a child, the tip of a tongue barely visible between concentrating lips, and then went back inside without calling to her. There was still time. The hearth occupied the corner nearest the courtyard opening. A shallow clay platform raised a hand's breadth of the beaten earth floor, blackened by years of cooking fires. Nefret knelt beside it and drew back the fired clay cover that kept the embers sleeping through the afternoon. A breath of warmth rose toward her face. She fed the coals with a pinch of dried dung and a few thin sticks of acacia wood, and leaned forward to blow gently until the first thread of smoke thickened and a small orange eye opened at the center of the pile. The evening meal was a plain one, as most evening meals were. There was bread from this morning's baking the flat, greyish rounds made from emmer wheat ground between two stones, dusted always with a little grit that no woman's grinding ever fully removed, and there was a clay pot of cooked lentils left from the day before, which needed only reheating and the addition of a few dried herbs to be made edible again. Nefret had a small onion too, which she would slice and char slightly over the fire, because Amenhotep preferred his onion soft and smoky at the end of a long day in the fields, and because a charred onion, more than almost anything, smelled to her like home. She worked without hurry. The fire's sound was a low, patient crackling. Outside, the village was settling into its end-of-day rhythms. A donkey complained somewhere to the north, the sound brief and emphatic. Children called to one another across a rooftop. A woman's voice rose and fell in what might have been a reprimand or the chorus of a song. It was difficult to tell at that distance. On the shelf above the hearth, a simple ledge of dried mud built into the wall, the small faience figure of Torit stood in her usual place, blue-green and rounded, one paw resting on the star symbol that meant protection. Nefret had not bought her. She had been her mother's, and before that, her mother's mother's. Also, she had been told. The glaze was worn on one side, rubbed smooth by the touch of many hands over many years. It was not unusual, in the course of an ordinary afternoon, to reach up and touch her briefly, not in formal prayer, exactly, but in the same way one might touch a doorpost on the way out, a small acknowledgement. A habit grown so old it no longer required a name. The onion went into the fire's edge and immediately began to soften and darken, and the smell rose up warm and good in the small room. When Amenhotep came home, he came as he always came, slowly, because the walk from the field to the village was not short, and because by the end of the day his body was weighted with the particular tiredness of a man who had been bending and straightening for many hours in the open sun. He was a lean man, not old but weathered in the way that all field workers were weathered, the skin of his arms and neck darker than his wife's by many shades, the palms of his hands roughened to the texture of dried leather. He ducked through the doorway, said Nefret's name in the flat, contented way of a man who is simply glad to be in the right place, and sat down on the low stool beside the hearth. Merit materialized from outside. She always seemed to sense her father's arrival before it happened and folded herself against him without ceremony, pressing her head against his arm the way a small cat presses against a warm surface. He rested a hand briefly on the top of her head and said something low that made her smile, and then she slipped away again to the corner where her clay figures lived. The family ate together on the mat, the bread torn and shared, the lentils ladled into shallow bowls, the charred onion divided in silence. There was beer, thin and slightly cloudy, kept in a sealed jar stoppered with a cone of clay. It was a daily staple, safer than the canal water, and sustaining in a way that water alone was not. They drank from it through a short reed, and no one thought anything of this. It was simply how one drank after the meal. Amenhotep spoke a little something about a problem with the irrigation channel on the eastern edge of the field, a blockage that the men had spent part of the afternoon clearing. Nefret mentioned the festival that Henert had spoken of at the canal. He listened and nodded, the way a man listens to something that is not urgent, but is pleasant to hear. The last light was fading from the top of the mud wall above them by the time the bowls were set aside. Merit, who had been struggling against sleep for some time, gave in without protest and curled on her sleeping mat with a small cloth figure tucked beside her, a rough human shape bound with strips of linen, but an eye sewn on with red thread, well loved into a kind of shapelessness. The house grew quieter. Nefret moved the damp linens to the roof, where the night air would finish what the afternoon warmth had begun. The roof was flat and open, and the sky above it was the deep blue of very late dusk, the first stars appearing not all at once but one by one, as if placed there with care. The river's breath came on the air from the east, cool and faintly green smelling. The smell of moving water and the dark silt it carried. The smell that had been rising from the Nile every evening for as long as anyone had kept count of evenings. She stayed there a moment longer than she needed to, below. Through the single small window cut into the roof parapet, the warm glow of the hearth's last embers could be seen, and Amenhotep's shadow moving across it, and the sound of his breathing already slowing towards sleep. Tomorrow, the fields would require him again. Tomorrow, Marit would find some new game among the stones. Tomorrow, the bread would be ground and baked, the water fetched, the fire fed, but the night, at least, was soft and full of stars, and for now, nothing more was asked of anyone. Before the sun had fully cleared the eastern cliffs, the village scribe was already at his work. He sat cross-legged on a worn reed mat beneath the broad shadow of the granary wall, where the mud brick still held the cool of the night against his back. His name was Userhat, and he was neither young nor old, somewhere in that patient middle distance of a man who has long since stopped measuring his years and begun measuring them instead. In the number of brushes he has worn down to nothing. In the stacks of papyrus fragments rolled and sealed and carried away by messengers he would never see again. Before him lay a wooden pallet, smoothed by decades of use, its two shallow wells holding cakes of black and red pigment. Beside it, a small clay cup of water, already filmed with ink from where he had wet his brush that morning. The brush itself was a thin reed, chewed at one end into a fine fringe of fibers, and he held it with the ease of a man who holds a familiar tool, not gripping, simply resting it in his fingers the way a sleeping child rests a hand against a pillow. He was working on a grain record. The papyrus before him was not new. It had been scraped and reused at least once, and if one held it at an angle in the light, the ghost lines of an older account still showed beneath the surface like shadows in shallow water. On top of those faint traces, Userhat was drawing a fresh column of figures that tallied output of 3 households from the previous harvest season, to be submitted to the estate administrator in the town upriver before the next inundation made the paths difficult to travel. He did not rush. Rushing was for men who did not trust their own hands. The hieratic script he used was not the formal hieroglyphic carving one might find on a temple column, those carefully chiseled images of seated gods and walking men. This was the working language of scribes, faster, rounder, worn smooth by repetition into something almost like a personal handwriting, though still precise enough that any trained reader would understand it without hesitation. Userhat had learned it as a boy at the house of a scribe in the neighboring Nome, sitting in a courtyard very much like this one, copying the same model text again and again until his wrist ached and his fingers were permanently stained at the tips. He still remembered the smell of that courtyard dust and palm shadow, and the faint sweetness of the date palms that grew along the western wall. He dipped his brush, tapped it once against the rim of the cup, and continued. Around him, the village was slowly coming into its morning motion. He could hear it without looking up, the particular sound of a settlement waking near the river, which was different from any other kind of waking. There was the low moan of a tethered ox somewhere past the storage buildings. There was the percussion of a woman grinding grain, rhythmic and unhurried, the stone moving in long ellipses over its flat base. There was the distant laughter of children already down by the water's edge, and beneath all of it, always, the soft and enormous patience of the Nile itself, moving past the reed beds with a sound that was less a sound than a kind of atmospheric pressure. Presence felt more in the chest than in the ears. A small boy appeared at the edge of the granary, ball and stood watching Userhat with the particular intensity that children reserve for things they do not fully understand. He was perhaps 6 years old, wearing only a string of blue faience beads around his neck, his head shaved except for the long side lock that hung over his right ear. He held a piece of dried bread in one hand and seemed to have forgotten about it entirely. Userhat glanced up without pausing his stroke. The boy did not move. He simply watched the brush moving across the surface of the papyrus with an expression that might have been awe, or might have been the simple absorption of a child who has not yet learned to pretend that he is not curious. Userhat finished the line he was writing, set the brush carefully across the rim of the palette, and regarded the boy with calm patience. "You want to know what it says," he said. It was not a question. The boy transferred his gaze from the papyrus to the scribe's face. He nodded, very slightly, as if committing to the admission only at the last possible moment. Userhat looked down at the column of figures before him. "It says, 47 Hekat of Emma from the household of Amenhotep, 31 Hekat from the household of Kj, 52 he cut from the household of Neferu. He looked back up at the boy. It says that 3 families worked through the heat of summer and the dust of harvest. And this is what they brought in. And this is what the administrator will record in his ledger. And that ledger will be stored in a sealed room. And one day, perhaps, someone will open that room and know the names of these families and what they grew. The boy considered this for a long moment. Will they remember them? He asked. Perhaps, User had said, if the room stays dry. He picked up his brush again, and the boy, satisfied with this answer or simply having exhausted his patience, turned and ran back toward the sound of the other children near the water. The morning deepened around the scribe. A pair of hoopoe birds settled briefly on the granary roof above him. Their striped crowns fanned wide, and then lifted again without any particular urgency. The shadows shifted. The cup of water grew warmer in the rising light. Userhat continued working, line by line, name by name, number by number, the dry arithmetic of sustenance, which was also, in its quiet way, a kind of preservation. Not the preservation of temples carved in stone to outlast dynasties. This was the other kind. The small, provisional, easily wetted preservation of daily things. It was enough. Most preservation was, when the column was finished, he held the papyrus up and let it dry in the morning air, watching the ink settle from its brief glossiness into the flat matte permanence of a finished line. Then he rolled it carefully, tied it with a strip of linen, and set it with the others in the shallow basket beside his mat. He would carry the basket to the estate administrator himself in 2 days' time, when the weekly boat came upriver. Until then, he had 3 more accounts to complete, a land boundary dispute to document in proper legal form, and a letter to copy for a widow in the village whose son had gone to work at a quarry site in the eastern desert and had not sent word in 5 months. User had picked up a fresh fragment of papyrus and smoothed it once across his knee. He dipped his brush. He began again. In the hour when the sun had climbed just high enough to drive the last blue coolness from the shadows, the river itself seemed to pause, not far from the village, where the bank curved gently outward and the papyrus reeds stood thick as a wall of bundled spears. A woman named Nefertari was already knee-deep in the Nile, her linen skirt hitched and tacked at the hip, her feet sinking softly into the dark silt with each slow step. She was not young, not old, somewhere in that middle country of life where the body knows its work without being asked. Her arms moved through the water in practiced arcs, guiding a loosely woven rush basket just below the surface, letting the current fill it and the mesh catch what the current carried. This was how her mornings had always been, and her mother's mornings before her, and likely her daughter's mornings in the years still waiting ahead. The Nile did not distinguish between them. It gave what it gave, and asked only that you show up at the right hour with the right vessel. Today the basket brought up a small, silver-bellied tilapia, then 2 more, their mouths opening and closing with patient bewilderment against the woven reeds. She transferred them to a clay pot tied at her waist with a cord of twisted flax, and they settled into the shallow water there with a soft, circular agitation. Further out, a pair of ducks moved through the surface film, unhurried, trailing green bronze ripples that spread and then were smoothed again by the river's indifferent motion. Nefertari worked her way slowly along the shallows, moving in the direction of the current rather than against it, the way her grandmother had taught her. The silt underfoot was cool and gave slightly with each step, as though the riverbed were breathing. Above the papyrus heads, the sky had gone from the tender pale gold of early morning to something harder and more certain, a blue so deep and unwavering it looked almost like a material. Like polished faience stretched from horizon to horizon, there was a smell to this part of the bank that she could never quite describe to anyone who hadn't stood here themselves. Green and mineral, with something living and faintly animal threaded through it. The breath of the river mixing with the mud, and the crushed stems of water plants, and the distant sweetness of lotus blossoms opening a little further downstream. It was not a delicate smell. It was the smell of something that sustained everything patient, generous, slightly overwhelming. She had for fish now, and a handful of small freshwater mussels she had found clustered against a submerged root, and she decided this was enough. The fish would go to the cooking fire in the courtyard. The mussels she would trade with the potter's wife, who had a fondness for them, and usually offered a small flatbread or a measure of dried figs in return. These exchanges were not recorded anywhere. No scribe set them down in hieratic script. They moved through the village like water through sand, invisible and sustaining. As he waded back toward the bank, her feet finding the firmer ground near the reed line, She noticed a group of young men upstream setting out in a low papyrus skiff alight. Elegant thing. Its prow curved upward in the shape of a bound sheaf, the whole vessel still carrying a faint green cast from the stems it had been made of. They were fishermen, but their net today was a large one, a dragged net meant for the deeper channel, and they moved into the current with the long deliberate strokes of people who had learned the river's mood and knew how to speak to it without argument. Nefertari watched them for a moment from the bank, wringing the water from her skirt. One of the young men called something to another, and there was brief laughter, low and easy, the way people laugh when the morning is still cool, and the work has not yet become heavy. She turned and walked back toward the village along the narrow path that wound through the reeds, her clay pot swinging slightly at her hip, the fish inside still moving in their few inches of water. The path was once smoothed by countless feet over countless mornings, its edges pressed down into the soft bank, and in places the mud still held the impressions of earlier travelers, the narrow wedge of a sandaled heel, the broader flat mark of a child's barefoot, the three-toed script of an ibis that had crossed some time before dawn. The village came back into view around the curve of the reed bed, the low mud brick walls the color of dried earth, the occasional date palm rising above the rooflines with its spray of fronds, the thin thread of smoke from a cooking fire that someone had already started, drifting up and unspooling quietly into the still air. A dog was asleep against the outer wall of the nearest house, its sight rising and falling almost imperceptibly, its paws crossed in a posture of complete and uncomplicated peace. Nefertari passed through the narrow gap in the outer wall that served as the village's informal western entrance, too modest a thing to be called a gate, just a place where the walls did not quite meet, worn smooth at shoulder height by the hands of everyone who had ever passed through and reached out to steady themselves. She set the clay pot down in the shade of the courtyard and stood for a moment with her hands on her lower back, looking up at the sky above the open square of the courtyard's mouth. The day would be warm. It was always warm. But there was a quality to this particular warmth, the way it settled onto the shoulders, not like weight, but like cloth, like something deliberate that made the morning feel less like a beginning and more like a continuation, as though this day and every day were simply one long, unbroken thread being drawn slowly through the same needle. She would clean the fish. She would start the fire. She would, at some point in the afternoon, take the mussels to the potter's wife and sit for a while in the shade of her doorway, to exchange a few words about nothing urgent, the way neighbors do when the hours allow it, and in the cool of the evening, when the river turned copper and then rose, and then the first stars appeared over the eastern hills. She would set out a small clay lamp on the threshold, as her mother had done, as everyone did, a quiet signal to whatever watched over such hours that the house was inhabited, that someone within it was still present and grateful. However ordinary the day had been, the fish rested in their pot, the smoke drifted upward, and the village settled into the particular rhythm of its morning, slow and purposeful as the river itself moving toward the sea it had always been moving toward, since before there were words for either the river or the sea. In the hour when the sun had climbed just high enough to make the shadows pull back beneath the acacia trees, like sleeping dogs retreating under a cart, the potter's wife, whose name was Hennet, was already at her wheel. She worked in the narrow strip of shade between the outer wall of her house and the low mud brick partition that separated her small courtyard from the lane. It was a position she had occupied nearly every morning of her adult life, and the ground there had been worn into a gentle basin by years of her sitting cross-legged, years of clay water dripping from her fingers, years of the wooden wheel turning on its peg with that particular soft scraping sound that the lane outside had long ago absorbed into its ordinary ambience, the way a river absorbs the sound of rain. The wheel itself had belonged to her husband's father. It was a heavy disc of fired clay, smoothed on its upper face to a dull sheen, and it turned on a wooden spindle set into a stone socket that was mortared into the earth. Hennet would set it spinning with a flat strike of her palm, then work quickly with both hands as it slowed, coaxing the wet clay upward, feeling for the even thickness of the walls with a touch that required no thought anymore, only attention. This morning, she was making storage jars, not large ones, not the great amphora-shaped vessels that sat at the back of the grain room and were sealed with linen stoppers and a stripe of mud. These were small, narrow-necked jars, the kind used for keeping rendered fat or a small reserve of oil, the kind that could sit on a shelf above the hearth without taking up the space of a human elbow. There was a steady trade in jars of this size. Mothers wanted them for thick paste and dried herb. Scribes' households needed them for the pigments that came up from the south, The ochre and the soot black and the ground malachite had kept in a sealed vessel far better than in an open dish. Hennet made these jars in sets of 4, because 4 fit evenly on the wooden board she used to carry them to the kiln, and because 4 was a number that seemed, through long custom, to satisfy people as if the world itself preferred small things to arrive in 4s. The clay she was working had been prepared the evening before. She mixed it herself from 2 sources. A pale, dense clay she dug from a particular cut in the bank some distance upriver where an old flood had left a deep lens of it below the reedy fringe, and a coarser, darker clay from a bed closer to the village, more full of sand, which she added in a proportion she had learned from her mother-in-law, and had never had reason to adjust. To this she worked in a little chaff fine, pale chaff from the last threshing which bound the walls against cracking during drying, and she kneaded the whole mass the night before with the heel of her hand until it had the particular resilience that told her it was ready, neither too stiff nor too yielding, the way bread dough feels just at the moment before it is set to rise. Now the clay came up under her hands in a smooth column, and she pressed her thumbs into its crown and drew the walls outward and upward with a motion that was, for all its technical precision, as slow and unhurried as breathing. The wheel made its soft sound. A dove moved on the roof above her. From the lane came the occasional passing of sandaled feet, a child's voice, the brief bellow of a goat being led somewhere it did not wish to go. Hennet did not look up at these things. She was not incurious about her neighbors, but the clay required the kind of presence that excluded distraction, not because the task was fragile in itself, but because a wall made while the mind was elsewhere tended to have. She had found a quality that showed in the finished piece a slight unevenness, a pinch in the wall where the attention had briefly lapsed that she found irritating in a private way she would not have described to anyone. By the time Nefertari's shadow fell across the threshold of the courtyard gate, Hennet had finished 2 jars and was shaping the 3rd. She did not stop working, but she raised her chin slightly in acknowledgement as Nefertari set the clay pot down on the low wall beside the gate, the part that held the mussels. Their shells dark and still beaded with river water. Nefertari said something about the morning, about the level of the water at the fishing shallows, about the young men who had gone out in the skiff. Hennet listened without turning her head. Her wheel was slowing. She struck it again, palm flat, and felt it resume its pace. The mussels would be good in a broth made with onion and dried fenugreek, Hennet thought. Her daughter, who had a tendency toward the kind of paleness that the village healer associated with a lack of the right kind of food, had been asking lately for something she described as tasting like the river. Children asked for strange things, and often the strangeness of what they asked for was worth paying attention to. The flatbread she owed Nefertari in return was already wrapped in a piece of worn linen on the shelf inside, for rounds, thicker than the bread made for a feast, the kind that kept well into the afternoon without going dry. She had made them the previous evening while the oven was still warm from the midday fire. Nefertari took the bread and went without lingering. There was no ceremony to the exchange, no formal expression of debt or obligation, only the small mutual recognition of women who had been conducting this kind of quiet economy with each other for years, each knowing what the other needed, each providing it without the necessity of negotiation. Hennet lifted the finished 3rd jar from the wheel and set it on the board to dry. She smoothed its rim once with a dampened thumb. Then she reached for a fresh ball of clay, pressed it flat against the wheel's face, and began again. The dove had moved to the acacia at the lane's edge and was making its low, continuous sound there, and the wheel turned, and the shade had shifted, slightly grown narrower on the west side, and marginally wider to the east and elsewhere in the village. The day was continuing in all the small ways that days continued, each person occupied with the particular work that the morning required of them, the whole settlement moving together in its slow and unremarkable rhythm, like water finding its way through familiar channels without needing to think about where it is going. Later, Hennet would carry the 4 dried jars to the kiln at the edge of the quarter and stack them among the other pieces already waiting there. But that was an afternoon task. For now, the clay was still wet, and the wheel had not yet stopped. The afternoon came slowly to the village, the way it always did in the season when the river ran low and the fields lay bare and waiting. The light thickened as it climbed toward its highest point, turning from the pale clarity of morning into something heavier, more golden, almost solid, as though the air itself had taken on the color of old linen left too long in the sun. The dogs had long since retreated beneath the acacia near the granary wall. The children had disappeared into doorways and shadows. Even the Ephellae seemed to slow, drifting in lazy arcs above the dust, rather than landing anywhere with purpose. It was the hour when most sensible people rested. Kha did not rest. He moved through the village carrying a wooden yoke across his shoulders, a clay vessel hanging from each end on twisted rope loops, and the particular unhurried expression of a man who has been doing the same task every afternoon for so many years that his body no longer required him to think about it. Kha was the water carrier for this part of the quarter, not officially appointed, not paid in any formal sense, but compensated in small, steady ways. A portion of bread here, a handful of dried figs there, a new pair of sandals when the old ones wore through, which happened more often than he would have preferred. He was perhaps 50 years old, perhaps older. It was difficult to say. His skin had the look of river mud that had dried and cracked and dried again across many seasons, and his eyes were the pale, sharp amber of a cat's, set in a face that was otherwise largely unremarkable. He had no wife. He had a son somewhere in the north, working the fields near a larger settlement, and they exchanged messages perhaps twice a year through travelers moving along the river road. This arrangement suited them both. The well from which Kha drew was on the eastern side of the quarter, set between two storage buildings whose mud brick walls had been built so close together that the passage between them was always in shade, even at midday. The well itself was older than anyone could remember, certainly older than the current headman's grandfather, who had died at what was said to be a very great age. Its stone rim had been worn smooth by generations of rope and hand, and the water it gave was cool and faintly sweet in a way that the river water rarely managed at this time of year. Kha lowered his rope, felt the familiar resistance of the water taking the vessel's weight, and waited. There was a particular sound a well made when it accepted the jar, a low, resonant gulp followed by a spreading silence, as though the water was considering what it had been given before deciding to give anything back. Kha had never spoken this observation aloud to anyone. It was simply something he knew, the way he knew the weight difference between a full jar and one that had taken in an air pocket, the way he knew by the feel of the rope when the vessel had tipped onto its side at the bottom and needed a gentle upward jerk to right itself. He pulled slowly, hand over hand, the rope passing through a worn groove in the stone that barely slowed it. The jar came up dark and dripping, and he poured it with care into the larger vessel on the left side of his yoke, watching the level rise and feeling, with the precision of long practice, exactly when to stop before the jar would become unmanageable to carry. Then he lowered the rope again. By the time he began his first circuit of the afternoon, the light had shifted just slightly westward, and the shadows had begun their long, imperceptible lean toward evening. He moved from household to household, pouring measured amounts into the large wide-mouthed jars that stood in each courtyard, or just inside each doorway, the jars that Hennet and other potters in the quarter had made. Season after season, each one slightly different in the hand, but consistent in purpose. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. Each household knew his hour, and the jar was always waiting. And if anyone was home, they would nod, or offer him a cup of beer, or simply continue what they were doing with the easy trust of people who have long since stopped thinking of a familiar thing as a courtesy. At the third house along the main lane, a woman named Mwa was sitting in her doorway sorting lentils, running handfuls through her fingers and letting the chaff and small stones fall to one side with the patience of someone engaged in a task that requires no urgency and tolerates no interruption. She was the widow of a man who had repaired fishing nets for most of his adult life, and she had taken over that work after his death, as had seemed natural, since she had sat beside him doing half of it for 20 years anyway. She kept a cat who was missing part of one ear, and who regarded Kha as he poured the water with the expression of someone who has considered the situation carefully and decided it is beneath comment. Mwa said, without looking up from her lentils, that the men who had been digging the new channel on the south field had come back this morning with mud to their knees and a disagreement about the correct angle of the slope. Kha agreed that slopes were difficult. She said one of them had cut his foot on a piece of broken vessel someone had discarded near the embankment. Kha said that was a pity. She said the foot was not serious and the man had simply been making more of it than was warranted. They both contemplated this for a moment, and then Kha moved on. The afternoon deepened as he continued his circuit, the yoke settling into its familiar press against the back of his neck. The vessel was growing lighter and then heavier again, as he returned to the well and filled them once more. He made this walk twice each afternoon in the cool months, 3 times in the heat of summer, when the river ran low and the stored water in the courtyard jars evaporated faster than anyone found convenient. He had done the calculation once of how many times he had drawn water from that particular well across his working life, and then had let the number go because it was very large and served no purpose to hold. Near the edge of the quarter, where the lane widened slightly before meeting the path that led toward the kiln, he paused. The kiln was already smoking. It was a low, wide structure of hardened mud brick, built into a slight rise in the ground so that the fire chamber sat below and the heat rose naturally through the stack of vessels above. Someone had loaded it earlier in the afternoon, and the smoke coming from the vent was the particular pale grey that meant the fire had caught cleanly and was burning steady. Kha watched it for a moment, a thin column rising and bending slightly in the almost imperceptible late afternoon current of air of the river, carrying with it the clean, sharp smell of fired clay that was different from any other smell, not quite smoke, not quite earth, something between the two that existed only in that particular transformation. He did not know much about pottery, but he knew that smell, and it told him, in its quiet way, that the day was continuing to move in the direction of evening, that the work of the afternoon was entering its final hours, and that somewhere across the village the same small accumulation of completions was gathering: lentils sorted, water carried, vessels fired, bread already cooling on the stone that would eventually resolve itself into night and rest and the long, even sound of the river moving south beneath a sky full of stars. He adjusted the yoke on his shoulders and turned back toward the well. There were 2 more houses to reach before the light changed. In the hour when the kiln smoke thinned to a pale thread and the sun dropped behind the western palms, the village began its slow, unhurried transformation from a place of work into a place of rest. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way water cools gradually, almost imperceptibly, until you notice that the quality of the air has changed, that the sounds around you have softened, that the light no longer presses down, but instead seems to gather and hold at the edges of things. The potters banged their kiln and wiped their hands on racks already dark with clay. The women who had been sorting grain on their rooftops folded their rush mats and carried them inside, tucking them against the wall for tomorrow. Children who had spent the afternoon chasing one another through the narrow lanes between houses returned now to doorways, pulled by the smell of smoke and onion rising from cooking pots, by the familiar sound of a mother's voice calling a name without urgency, with the particular tone that meant the day was done, along the bank of the Nile, where the afternoon fishermen had worked their lines in the shallows. The boats were being drawn up and turned. A boy of perhaps 8 or 9 helped an old man haul a skiff clear of the water, the old man's hands guiding more than pulling now, his strength more ceremonial than practical, though neither of them seemed to notice this. They overturned the boat on the dry grass above the waterline, and the boy sat on its hull for a moment, looking out at the river. The Nile in the early evening carried a light that was unlike its morning light. In the mornings it was white and sharp, full of promise and mild anxiety. Now it was amber, bronze in the deeper channels, smooth as polished horn where the current ran slow along the near bank. A heron stood at the water's edge with the absolute stillness of a thing that has decided, for the moment, not to exist. Egrets moved in the distance, white stitches against the dark line of reeds. The boy watched all of this without naming any of it. He was simply there, and the river was simply there, and for a little while that was enough. Closer to the center of the village, the household of a carpenter named Hariho was already at supper. The table, if it could be called that, being little more than a low-woven stand set in the middle of the main room, held a clay bowl of cooked lentils, a smaller dish of leeks softened in oil, and a round of flatbread that had been made that morning and was still good, though beginning to firm at the edges. His wife, Nefert, sat across from him. Their 2 daughters ate quickly with the focused efficiency of children who have played hard and are now very hungry. Hariho ate slowly, as he always did in the evenings. Through the day, he was quick with his hands. His chisel moved in short, certain strokes. His measurements were made without hesitation, but at table he seemed to decompress by degrees. Each bite taken deliberately, each pause a small rest. He had spent the afternoon fitting a new door frame for the house at the end of the north lane, a job that had required him to trim the lintel twice because the opening was not quite square. It was the sort of invisible problem that only the craftsman would know about, and he had solved it without complaint and without mention, and no one who walked through the doorway for the next generation would ever know. Nefert told him that Mutimwaya's cat had killed a snake near the storage jars, a small one. but still, and that two of the women at the washing place had argued over whose linen was whose. A mix-up that began innocently and ended with some dignity bruised on both sides. She told him these things not because they were important, but because the day accumulated detail, the way a riverbank accumulates silt. And it was pleasant to let some of it settle, to say it aloud, and watch it lose its weight. He listened. He tore a piece of bread. He said that the lintel had given him trouble. She said that was a shame. He agreed that it was, though it was fixed now. They sat for a while after the girls had gone to their sleeping corner, wrapped in the linen that served them through both the warm and the mild cold of this season. A small oil lamp burned on a shelf, its flame so steady it might have been carved rather than lit. The walls of the house, packed mud and pale limestone plaster, held the warmth of the day still, releasing it slowly as the night deepened. Outside, the village had grown nearly quiet. A dog barked once near the granary and was not answered. Somewhere further along the lane, an older woman's voice rose briefly in what might have been prayer or might have been a fragment of song. It was hard to tell in the dark, and it did not matter, for the sound was soft and completed itself without asking anything of those who heard it. Kha, the water carrier, had returned his yoke to its place beside his door, and was sitting on the low step outside his house with a piece of dried fish and a cup of barley beer that his neighbor had left for him that afternoon. Payment of a kind for carrying 2 extra loads to her kitchen. He ate without hurry, looking at the lane, at the way the lamplight from the nearest doorway made a small golden rectangle on the packed earth. He was thinking about nothing in particular, or perhaps about his son somewhere in the fields of the north, or about the ache in his right shoulder that had been present now for 3 seasons, and which he had come to regard less as pain and more as a kind of companion. Above the village, the sky was completing its own long transition. The last color had gone from the west. Stars were appearing not all at once, but one by one, as if each required a moment of consideration before committing to the dark. The great river caught their light and held it faintly, so that the water seemed to glow from somewhere beneath its surface, patient and immense and entirely indifferent to the small warm lights of the village arranged along its western bank. The day was not ending so much as subsiding, folding itself down into the earth and the reed and the water, into the breathing of sleeping children and the last settling creak of wooden beams, releasing the heat of the sun into the gentle and remarkable dark of another night in this place that had stood beside this river for longer than any name given to it could hold. And tomorrow, in the grey hour before the birds began, the water would still be there, and the light would return, and someone would be the first to step outside and begin again. In the hour before the village fully woke, the darkness was not quite dark anymore, and the silence was not quite silent. A pale, undecided light had begun to gather at the eastern edge of the sky, not yet gold, not yet anything with a name, and with it came the first sounds of morning. A dog shifting in the dust somewhere near the granary wall, the low, periodic complaint of a tethered goat, and then, carried across the water from the far bank, the long, hollow cry of a bird that might have been an ibis greeting the reed beds before anyone else had thought to open their eyes. Kha was already awake. He had not, in truth, slept very deeply. His shoulder had spoken to him in the small hours not sharply, only insistently, as it sometimes did when the night air came of the river with a particular heaviness, and so he had lain on his mat and listened to the village breathing around him. And eventually the breathing had changed, becoming lighter, more deliberate, until it was no longer sleep, but the pause before waking. He rose carefully, the way a man does when he has learned that haste in the early morning costs him comfort for the rest of the day. And he went to the low shelf beside the door where a clay pot held water from the evening before. He poured a little into his cup palm and pressed it against his face. And for a moment he simply stood, letting the coolness settle into him, looking out through the doorway at the lane, which was still the color of ash. The first of the bakers would already be at their fires. This was something Kha had noticed over many years, not as a thought exactly, but as a quiet piece of certainty that lived alongside all the other certainties of his days. Before the light came, before the birds were fully committed to their noise, the smell of bread arrived. It moved through the lane softly, without announcement, and if you happened to be awake at the right moment, you could catch it arriving, could follow its slow progress from the house where old Iber's daughter-in-law kept her clay ovens close against the south-facing wall. The dough had been prepared the night before, shaped, left to rest beneath damp cloth, and now it was meeting the heat. And the whole small transaction between grain and fire was drifting outward into the morning air. Kha breathed it in and felt, as he usually did at this hour, a kind of uncomplicated gratitude. He took his tools from the corner where he kept them, wrapped in a strip of linen that had once been something else, a garment, perhaps, or a length of cloth from some trade, and he went out into the lane. His feet knew the uneven ground without needing him to look down. The path to the edge of the cultivation, where the soil softened and darkened and became the land the river had made, was one he had walked so many times that it had become almost an extension of his own body. The commission was a boundary marker. A farmer named Userhat, a man of perhaps 50, with a beard that came in patchy and a way of talking that suggested he had rehearsed everything twice before saying it, had contracted with the scribe's house some weeks earlier for a stone marker to be placed at the northern end of his field, where his boundary met that of a neighbor with whom he was on careful, watchful terms. The marker would bear Userhat's name and a brief record of the boundary's establishment, which the scribe had composed and which Kha had been given a small piece of ceramic tile to carry, with the signs written out in a clear hand for him to follow. He had studied them the evening before, tracing the shapes with his fingertip in the lamplight. Now, in the early morning, he reached the place where the stone had been set into the ground 2 days prior, a rough block of limestone, pale and slightly porous, brought down from the quarry site half a day's walk to the east. It sat at a slight angle, which Kha had corrected yesterday afternoon, packing fine rubble and dry earth around its base until it stood as a stone ought to stand. With the quiet assurance of something that intended to remain, the carving itself would take the better part of the day. He settled himself beside the stone, arranged his tools, the copper chisels in their order, the wooden mallet, the smaller picks for fine work, and he looked at the surface for a long moment before touching it. This was habit, but it was also something more than habit. There was a particular quality to blank stone that asked for attention. It was not quite patience, not quite inspection. It was closer to the feeling of listening before speaking, of finding the measure of a thing before committing to it. The light had strengthened enough now to work by, and from somewhere behind him, deeper into the village, he could hear the day assembling itself, a woman's voice calling a name, the rhythmic knock of a wooden implement against the side of a jar, the soft percussion of someone beating dust from a mat. Kha set the tip of his chisel against the stone and struck once, lightly, to hear the sound it made. The limestone answered well, not too soft, not resistant in the way that made the hand ache by midday. He settled into the first sign a seated man, small and precise, which would begin the name of Userhat, and the sound of his mallet joined the other sounds of morning without disturbing any of them. The ibis, or something very like it, called again from the reed beds. The smell of bread had not quite left the air. Somewhere, a child was already running along a lane with the particular lightness that belongs only to early morning, before the heat gives the day its weight. Kha worked on. The stone received each mark without complaint. The signs emerged slowly, not quickly enough to seem easy, not slowly enough to seem strained, and as the sun climbed to the point where it cleared the top of the date palms along the eastern edge of the cultivation, the name of Userhat was half formed in pale limestone, and the field beyond it was beginning to shimmer faintly with the first suggestion of the day's heat. The river, visible at the edge of his vision, moved as it always moved, without urgency, without pause, carrying its dark water southward and southward in the way that it would carry water long, after every name carved into every stone had softened back into dust, and the fields had changed, and the village had changed, and even the birds rising from the reeds each morning would be different birds, though they would still rise, still call, still turn their long necks toward the light. But that was a thought for later, or perhaps for never. For now there was the stone, and the chisel, and the name of a farmer who wanted his boundary acknowledged, and the morning, which was still young enough to hold all of it comfortably, when Userhat himself appeared at midday, walking carefully over the furrows in his good sandals to see how the work was progressing. Kha would show him what had been done, and the farmer would look at the signs for a long moment and nod, and perhaps say something about the depth of the cuts, and Kha would answer him, and they would stand together briefly over the stone in the noon sun before Userhat walked back toward his house and Kha returned to his work. But that was still some hours away, and the morning was asking nothing yet except attention, which Kha gave it willingly, stroke by careful stroke, as the light grew and the river ran and the day continued its unhurried opening. Like a flower that had done this many times before and saw no reason to rush. The sun had climbed well past its gentler hour by the time Userhat appeared at the edge of the field, his sandals leaving slow, deliberate prints in the soft earth between the cultivated rows. He walked the way a man walks when he has been watching the sky all morning from somewhere else, a little stiff in the shoulders, a little careful with each step, as though the ground itself might offer him some news he had not yet received. Kha heard him before he saw him. The scrape of a sandal sole against a dry clod of earth, the faint sound of breath drawn in through the nose, the sounds a man makes when he is trying to approach quietly, but is too preoccupied to manage it properly. Kha set down his smaller pick and straightened his back, pressing one hand against the base of the limestone block to steady himself as he rose. The marker stood a little taller than a man's knee. It had been rough and uneven when it arrived from the quarry, marked with the marks of the rougher tools that had separated it from the hillside, and there had been a long diagonal fault line running through its upper face that Kha had spent the better part of an afternoon deciding whether to work around or simply to fill. He had worked around it in the end, letting the inscription curve very slightly, almost imperceptibly, to avoid the compromised stone. Whether Userhat would notice this small adjustment, Kha did not know. Userhat came to stand beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The farmer bent forward at the waist and brought his face close to the carved surface, squinting in the way older eyes must when confronted with fine detail in bright light. The hieroglyphs were clean. Kha had taken his time with each one, referencing the ceramic tile again and again, checking the proportions of the signs against the ones the scribe had drawn, adjusting the depth of the cuts so that the letters would hold shadow and remain legible even when the afternoon sun fell flat across the stone. Userhat straightened slowly. He did not smile exactly, but something in his expression settled, some held thing released. He said that it was good. He said it the way a man says such things when he means them, but is not accustomed to saying them freely. The words offered plainly, without ornament. Then he walked around the stone, crouching on the far side to examine the face that looked toward his neighbor's field, the face that bore the boundary record. He studied it for a long time. A pair of hoopoes called somewhere in the tamarisk scrub along the water's edge, their soft repeated notes drifting across the field like something half-remembered, when Userhat stood again. He asked Kha whether the stone would hold its position through the inundation. This was the real question. Kha understood, the one that had been behind all the others since the day the commission was first discussed at the scribe's house. The inundation would come in a matter of weeks. The Nile would rise and spread across the low fields, swallowing the boundary lines that existed now only as agreed upon distances, and spoken arrangements and the memory of old men. When the water receded, the stone would remain, or it would not. Kha told him that the foundation had been set below the level of the ordinary flood. He told him that the stone was limestone from a sound stratum, that it had no deep faults below the surface where it sat, and that the weight of it alone would resist any current this close to the cultivation's edge. He said these things carefully, choosing his words the way he chose his tools, the right one for the particular work, neither too heavy nor too fine. Userhat listened, nodding once or twice, his eyes still on the stone. Then he reached into a fold of his linen and produced a small cloth bundle, knotted at the top, and held it out. Inside were dried figs, a portion of flatbread wrapped in a broad leaf, and 3 onions, modest payment for the final day of work, agreed in advance. Kha accepted these without comment, placing them carefully on top of his wrapped tools. They stood together for another moment in the warmth of the late morning. Across the river, visible from where they stood as a long pale smear of low cliffs above the dark line of cultivation on the far bank, a haze was beginning to gather in the upper air. The day was moving toward its fullness, the light losing its earlier clarity, the shadows drawing back beneath the palms and the low scrub. Everything was becoming very still in the particular way of Egyptian midday, as though the landscape itself were holding its breath against the heat. Userhat said, without looking up, that he had heard the neighbor had also commissioned a marker. He said it the same way he said everything, quietly, with the weight of the words distributed carefully across the silence. He did not ask a question. He simply let the observation sit between them. Kha said he did not know anything about that. Userhat nodded again, and looked at the stone once more, and then turned and walked back the way he had come, his sandals finding the same slow path between the rows. Kha remained where he was for a little while after the farmer had gone. He gathered his tools into their linen wrapping, tying the ends with the familiar knot he always used, the cloth once smooth at the fold from years of being tied and untied in exactly this way. He ate one of the dried figs and drank from the small clay jar he had brought from the village in the cool of the morning, the water now warm but still welcome. He looked at the stone, his work, and not quite his work, belonging now to the field and to the farmer and to the record of a boundary that would outlast both of them. The walk back to the village would take him along the bank, past the moored reed boats and the washing place and the low wall behind the temple precinct, where the priest sometimes left offerings of grain and oil to dry in the sun. It was a walk he knew so well that his feet would carry him without deliberation, and he would have time, in the loose, unhurried afternoon way, to let his mind settle into the rhythm of the path and the sound of the water and whatever the remainder of the day might quietly bring. The fig was still sweet on his tongue when Keiichi lifted his back and turned his back to the stone. He did not look at the marker again. A craftsman who had finished his work and then stood admiring it was a craftsman who had run out of work to do. And Keiichi had learned this distinction early from his father, who had learned it from his own father before him, a quiet inheritance, passed not in words, but in the particular way a man's shoulders settle when something is complete and it is time to move on. So he settled his shoulders, adjusted the weight of the bag, and began walking south along the bank. The afternoon light had changed while he worked. The morning's white glare had softened into something more golden, more slanted, and the river caught it differently now, not the flat, metallic brightness of midday, but a shifting warmth that moved in slow patterns across the water wherever the current ran shallow over sand. The far cliffs, which had looked pale and almost colorless at noon, had taken on a reddish tone, as though the stone itself were warming from within. Keiichi watched them for a moment without slowing his stride, then looked away. The cliffs were always there. They would be there long after the boundary marker had dissolved back into the earth, long after the names carved into its face were illegible to anyone living. A pair of egrets stood motionless at the water's edge ahead of him, white as linen, their long necks curved in perfect patience. He passed within a few arms' lengths of them, and they did not move, did not even turn their heads. Whatever they were watching for in the shallows was of greater interest than a man with a bag of tools walking south. The path narrowed where the bank vegetation crowded in papyrus stands taller than his shoulder, their feathery tops swaying in the faint afternoon wind, the stems thick and triangular and faintly cool to the touch when his arm brushed against them. Somewhere inside the thicket, frogs were calling a deep, rhythmic sound that had nothing urgent in it, only the steady pulse of something living in its element and perfectly content to announce the fact. Keiichi found himself slowing slightly without meaning to. The sound had that quality. He passed the washing place a short while later. It was a low stone shelf at the bank's edge, worn smooth by generations of use. And at this hour 3 women were there too, kneeling at the water, working wet cloth against the stone with practiced circular motions. The third standing further up the bank, shaking out a length of linen that snapped and billowed in the air. Their voices carried to him before he was close enough to make out words, and he made out the rhythm of a conversation rather than its content, a question, a reply, laughter, a pause, more words. One of the kneeling women glanced at him as he passed. He raised his free hand briefly in acknowledgement. She returned the gesture and went back to her work without a break in whatever she had been saying. He was thirsty again. He stopped and unslung the clay jar, but when he tipped it, there was almost nothing left, a mouthful, warm and faintly mineral, which he held in his mouth for a moment before swallowing. He would refill it at the village well. It was not far now. The low wall of the temple precinct appeared through the trees ahead, mud brick, white plastered, beginning to show the faint turn of exposed clay where the plaster had chipped away in places along the base. The temple itself was set back from the wall and mostly invisible from the path. Only the upper portion of one carved gateway appeared visible above the roofline of the granary storehouse that stood between them. Keiichi did not go in. He rarely had cause to go in. The priests moved through their own rhythms inside those walls, and ordinary men entered for festivals and for specific requests, not casually, not on a walk home from a morning's work. But there was something steadying in passing it, the same steadying quality as the cliffs, perhaps. The sense of something that had been there before you and would remain after, past the temple wall. The first houses of the village appeared. It was the smell that announced them more than the sight. Cookfires starting up for the evening meal. A thick warm smell of charcoal and onion and something fatty rendering down in a pot. A dog was sleeping against the outer wall of the nearest house, its legs running in some dream, and it did not wake as Keiichi passed. A child sat cross-legged in a doorway, wholly absorbed in something held in both hands, a clay figure, perhaps, or a piece of carved wood. It was difficult to tell. The child did not look up. Keiichi turned off the main path and into the narrow lane that led toward his own house, passing the well on the way and pausing long enough to draw water, lower the jar, refill it, and drink twice with both hands cupped. The water from this well had a slight sweetness to it that the river water never quite managed. He did not know why. He had asked once, and no one had been able to explain it satisfactorily. So he had simply accepted it as one of those small gifts that certain places offer without explanation. His wife was in the courtyard when he came through the low gate, crouched over a stone quern, grinding grain. She looked up, but did not stop the motion the flat, steady back and forth of the grinding stone that he had watched her do 1,000 times in 1,000 different lights. Her arms were dusted pale with flour to the elbows. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. She nodded, satisfied by this, and looked back down at her work. He set his bag against the wall in its usual place, in the shade of the acacia that grew at the courtyard's edge, and sat down on the low bench his father had built there, which was old enough now that the wood had gone almost black. He set the clay jar on the ground between his feet. The evening was beginning to settle around the village, the light lowering, the shadows lengthening across the packed earth of the courtyard. The cook fire smell growing stronger as more fires were lit. From somewhere nearby came the sound of a wooden flute. Someone practicing the same short phrase over and over, not quite getting it right each time, trying again without frustration, only persistence. Kei listened to it without identifying it as music or as noise. It was simply part of the evening, the way the frogs had been part of the afternoon. The day was not yet over. There was still the evening meal to eat, still the hour or two of fading light in which small repairs were made and tools checked and plans for the following morning formed and set aside. But the weight of the work was gone from his shoulders, and the stone stood where it needed to stand. And somewhere back along the river path, the boundary marker waited in the earth with Yuzahat's name and the name of the field and the depth of the ground it marked. Patient and mute and perfectly indifferent to everything the inundation might bring, the grinding stone moved back and forth. The flute tried its phrase again. The acacia shifted faintly above him in what remained of the afternoon wind. There would be time tomorrow to walk north toward the quarry, storehouse, and speak to the man thereabout. The next commission, a lintel piece, or so he had heard, for a house being built on the far edge of the village. But that was tomorrow. Tomorrow had its own weight. This evening had only the smell of cooking and the sound of the millstone and the slow cooling of the air against his arms, which had been in the sun all day and were warm to their own touch. The way stone is warm when the light has been on it for hours.